When William Hayes came home early from a business trip, he didn't expect to find his housekeeper sleeping on the floor with his granddaughter. What happened after shook the walls of his mansion. The wind outside howled against the walls of the Hayes estate, a sprawling property on the edge of Lake Tahoe. Inside, the air was still, almost too still for a home that was supposed to be filled with warmth. It was nearly midnight when William Hayes pulled into the driveway, his black Escalade crunching over patches of icy gravel. He had cut his business trip short, something he almost never did. William was known for two things: his staggering wealth and his rigid schedule. He built his fortune in tech, and with it came a reputation for being detached, calculated. Even with his own family, his love often came in the form of financial support rather than presence. But tonight was different. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He stepped inside, the faint glow of the security lights outlining the marble hallway. The house felt cold, but it wasn't the temperature. It was the absence of movement, the quiet that pressed against him. He removed his coat and headed up the staircase, his leather shoes making soft contact with the steps. He didn't have a clear reason for checking the nursery first, maybe curiosity, maybe guilt. When he reached the doorway, he froze. On the soft beige carpet beside the crib, Clara Jennings lay on her side, one arm gently curled around his granddaughter. The baby's small head rested against her chest, both of them breathing in the same slow rhythm. A folded blanket was beneath Clara as a makeshift bed, and a damp washcloth sat on the floor nearby. The crib, pristine and untouched, stood a few feet away. For a man like William, who measured life in efficiency and precision, the scene was jarring. He stepped closer, his voice low. "Clara?" Her eyes fluttered open, confusion mixing with fatigue. She quickly sat up, careful not to disturb the baby. "Mr. Hayes, I didn't hear you come in. What are you doing down here?" His tone wasn't angry, but it was firm, the way a man speaks when he's trying to understand something that doesn't fit into his world. "She had a fever earlier," Clara explained, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't want to leave her alone in the crib. Thought if I stayed close, I'd notice if she got worse." William's brow furrowed. "On the floor?" "I didn't want to risk falling asleep in the chair and dropping her," Clara said. "This way, if she fussed, I'd feel it right away." There was no hint of embarrassment in her words, just the plain, unvarnished truth. She wasn't performing kindness for credit. She was simply doing what she thought was right. William looked down at his granddaughter. The faint flush on her cheeks was evidence of the fever, but she seemed peaceful now. Something about the sight stirred him, though he couldn't put it into words. For a moment, he didn't think about his stock portfolio or the meeting he'd left behind in San Francisco. He thought about the fragility of the little girl in Clara's arms, and the fact that it wasn't family protecting her tonight. It was the housekeeper. Clara adjusted her position slightly, mindful of his gaze. "I know it's not how things are usually done," she added, "but sometimes the usual way isn't the best way." William didn't respond right away. His instinct was to remind her of the household standards, to keep the lines clear between staff and family. But instead, he found himself watching the way Clara shielded the baby with her body, the way her fingers rested lightly on the child's back as if she were made of glass. The silence stretched until it became almost uncomfortable. Finally, William spoke. "Put her in the crib. You need rest, too." Clara nodded, though her eyes lingered on the baby a moment longer before she stood. She placed the infant gently into the crib, tucking the blanket around her. William watched every movement, noticing how deliberate, how careful they were. When Clara straightened, she met his eyes again. "She's a good baby," she said softly. "She just needs someone close sometimes. We all do." He didn't have a response for that, not one he was willing to share. Instead, he stepped back from the doorway, letting her pass. But as she walked by, he caught the faint scent of lavender from her sweater, the same scent that now clung to his granddaughter. William stayed in the nursery a moment longer, his hands resting on the crib rail. The child stirred, then settled again. Something about the quiet presence of the room felt heavier than before. He wasn't sure if it was the weight of responsibility or something else entirely. He left the nursery, but the image of Clara on the floor stayed with him. It followed him down the stairs, through the marble hallway, and into the study where he poured himself a glass of bourbon. The amber liquid caught the light, but his thoughts were elsewhere. But as he sat there, he couldn't shake the question. Why had it taken a stranger to show that kind of care? The next morning, the estate was quieter than usual. Snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the driveway and the tall pines beyond the property gates. William rarely ate breakfast at home, but that morning he lingered in the kitchen, a half-drunk mug of coffee in hand, waiting. He told himself he was simply checking in on the household before heading to his office in Carson City, but truthfully, he wanted to speak with Clara. She appeared just after 8, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, dressed in a navy sweater and gray slacks. She carried the baby on her hip, a small bottle tucked in the crook of her arm. The child's fever had broken, and a faint smile played across her lips as she stared up at Clara. William gestured toward the table. "Can you sit for a moment?" Clara hesitated, adjusting her grip on the baby. "Of course, sir. Just let me put her down." When she returned, she folded her hands on the table, her posture straight but not stiff. "Is something wrong?" William studied her for a moment as if trying to decide whether this was a conversation he even wanted to have. "Last night, when I came home, I wasn't expecting to find you on the floor like that." Her gaze didn't waver. "I know it's not exactly professional, but she needed me close. That's all there was to it." "I'm not saying you did anything wrong," William replied, his voice measured. I've never seen anyone care for her like that. Not even—" He stopped himself, unwilling to finish the sentence about his daughter's detached style of motherhood. Clara broke the silence. "When my youngest was born, she had trouble breathing. I spent nights sitting on the floor next to her bassinet, too scared to sleep in my own bed. I guess old habits stay with you." Her words were a matter of fact, but they carried an undercurrent of memory, the kind that's stitched into you so deeply it can't be separated from who you are. William leaned back in his chair. "Most people would have called a nurse, or at least asked for help. Most people don't see the difference between looking after someone and truly being there for them," Clara said gently. "Sometimes you have to do what's inconvenient if it means the person in your care feels safe." For a moment, William's expression shifted, something between defensiveness and curiosity. "You're telling me you slept on that floor because it was the better thing to do?" "Yes," she said plainly. "Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. That's the only reason that matters." There was no challenge in her tone, but the words stayed with him, hanging in the air between them. William wasn't used to being spoken to in such a way, not disrespectful, but unflinchingly honest. It made him uncomfortable, and he wasn't sure why. He cleared his throat. "Do you always work like this? Going above what's expected?" Clara gave a small shrug. "I work the way I'd want someone to treat my own children or grandchildren. Money's part of a job, but it's not the whole of it." Something in that answer unsettled him, not because he disagreed, but because it reminded him of a truth he'd managed to avoid for years, that being present is not the same as being available. The kitchen clock ticked softly in the background. William realized he'd been staring at the same point on the table, lost in thought. He shifted, trying to reclaim his usual composure. "You know," he said finally, "most employers wouldn't like the idea of staff sleeping in the nursery." "I understand that," Clara replied. "And if you'd prefer I didn't, I won't do it again. But I wouldn't change what I did last night." Her certainty was disarming. It wasn't arrogance, it was conviction, built from years of knowing when to stand firm. William found himself almost respecting her for it. Before he could respond, the baby let out a small cry from the other room. Clara excused herself, disappearing down the hallway. William sat alone for a moment, swirling the last of his coffee in the cup. He told himself this was just a matter of household boundaries, that nothing more would come of it. But he knew that wasn't true. When Clara returned, the baby rested against her shoulder, already calming. William stood, straightened his jacket, and cleared his throat. "Thank you for explaining yourself," he said. "I appreciate the honesty." Clara gave a polite smile. "Honesty's easier than remembering a story you made up." William almost smiled at that. Almost. He left the kitchen, telling himself he needed to get to his office. But as he stepped outside into the cold, the conversation replayed in his mind. There was something about the way Clara spoke, direct, unpolished, real, that made it difficult to file the incident away as a minor anomaly. But the rest of the staff wouldn't let it fade quietly, and that was when the whispers began. By midday, the kitchen had become the quiet stage for a different kind of performance. Half-spoken comments, sideways glances, and the soft clink of cutlery against china. In a house as large as the Hayes estate, news traveled in strange ways. Sometimes it moved in the open, like a gust of wind through an open door. Other times, it crept in like steam, curling around corners until it touched every room. Clara was in the pantry restocking formula when she overheard the first murmur. "Can you believe she was in the nursery all night?" whispered Denise, the head housekeeper, to Martha, the family's chef. "On the floor, with the baby." Martha kept her voice low, but her tone was pointed. "That's not part of her job description. Boundaries are there for a reason." Clara kept her back turned, pretending to read the label on a box of cereal. She had no interest in defending herself to people who had already made up their minds, but it didn't stop there. As she moved through the house, changing linens, folding laundry, she caught fragments of the same conversation in different voices. "They say Mr. Hayes saw it himself." "Well, you know he's particular. Wonder what he thought." "I heard his daughter isn't happy about it." It didn't take long for Clara to realize that what had happened in the nursery wasn't staying between her and William. The staff seemed split into two camps, those who thought her actions were an overreach and those who saw it as an act of rare compassion. Later that afternoon, William crossed paths with Denise in the hallway. She was always careful with her words around him, but her curiosity outweighed her restraint this time. "Sir, I hope you don't mind me asking," she began cautiously, "but is everything all right with the baby?" "She's fine," William replied, his tone clipped. "Why?" "Oh, no reason. Just, we heard you were in the nursery last night, that you found Clara—" William cut her off with a glance that made her step back slightly. "I don't recall asking for your opinion on the matter, Denise." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded once and excused herself. Still, he knew her version of that conversation would find its way to the others by dinner. By evening, the undercurrent of speculation was impossible to ignore. Even the groundskeeper, who rarely spoke to the indoor staff, muttered something about how different things were getting as William passed him near the garage. At dinner, William sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, his daughter Amanda seated halfway down. She was tapping through her phone, barely glancing up as she asked, "So I hear you came back last night." He set his fork down. "Who told you that?" "Amanda," he said evenly. "I didn't realize my travel schedule was a matter for the household committee." Her lips curved into a dry smile. "It is, when it involves the help." He met her gaze, unflinching. "Clara did what she thought was best for your daughter." "That's not her place," Amanda shot back. "I have rules for a reason." "She was sick," William said. "Fever. Clara stayed close so she could watch her. Do you have a problem with that?" Amanda set her phone down, leaning forward slightly. "Yes, I do. That's exactly the kind of thing that blurs lines. Today it's the nursery. Tomorrow it's what? Taking her out without permission? Deciding what's best without asking me?" William didn't respond right away. The conversation wasn't about Clara anymore. It was about control and the way Amanda saw the people who worked in the house. When dinner ended, he walked alone down the hallway toward his study. From somewhere behind him, he caught the sound of Martha's voice. "Mark my words, this isn't going to end quietly." The comment wasn't meant for him, but it stayed in his ears as he closed the study door. He poured himself a drink and stared at the fire. The embers glowed a deep orange, reminding him of the warmth in Clara's arms as she held his granddaughter. But before the night was over, Amanda would decide she needed to speak to Clara herself, and that meeting wouldn't be nearly as polite. Clara was in the laundry room the next morning, folding a neat stack of fresh towels, when Amanda's voice broke the quiet. "Clara, can I have a word?" The tone wasn't hostile, but it carried that clipped precision people use when they expect to be obeyed without question. Clara placed the last towel on the pile and turned, smoothing her sweater. "Of course, ma'am." Amanda didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I've been hearing a lot about last night, about you staying in the nursery with my daughter." Clara met her eyes calmly. "Yes, ma'am, she had a fever. I didn't want her to be alone." "That's not your decision to make," Amanda said, her words sharp but measured. "We have procedures in place for a reason. If she's sick, you call me. Or a doctor. You don't—" "Lie on the floor with her?" Clara finished softly. Amanda's mouth tightened. "Exactly. That's crossing a line." Clara didn't look away. "I understand your concern, but sometimes a baby needs more than a bottle and a blanket. She needed to feel safe. If that meant I was on the floor all night, then that's what I was willing to do." Amanda's eyes narrowed. "You think I don't make her feel safe?" That's not what I said, Clara replied, her tone even. I think safety can come from many places. Last night it came from me being close to her. Amanda folded her arms, her posture stiff. You work for this family, Clara. Your job is to follow instructions, not decide what's best without asking. Clara hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I respect your rules, but respect also means acting when a child's well-being is at stake, even if it's inconvenient. Inconvenient? Amanda repeated, her voice rising just a notch. Yes, Clara said. It's not easy to sleep on a cold floor, but it's harder to sleep knowing a child might wake up frightened and burning with fever. Amanda's expression shifted. There was a flicker of something there, though whether it was guilt or anger, Clara couldn't tell. Before Amanda could respond, the door opened. William stood in the doorway, his presence instantly altering the air in the room. Everything all right here? He asked, his eyes moving between them. We're having a discussion, Amanda said quickly. It sounds more like an argument, William replied. His gaze landed on Clara. Is there a problem? Clara glanced at Amanda, then back to William. We were talking about last night. William stepped inside, letting the door close behind him. I already spoke to Clara about it, she explained herself. And I'm telling you, it's a boundary issue, Amanda said. It's unprofessional. William's voice was calm but edged with steel. Professionalism doesn't mean leaving a sick child to sleep alone so we can all be comfortable. Clara made a call I agree with. Amanda stared at him. You're siding with her? I'm siding with my granddaughter's well-being, he said, and I'm starting to think the real problem here isn't Clara's judgment. It's the way you think about the people who work here. Amanda's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. The tension in the room was thick enough to feel in the chest. William turned to Clara. You did the right thing. Clara's eyes softened, though her voice remained steady. Thank you, sir. Amanda gave a short, dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. Unbelievable, she muttered, brushing past William and leaving the room. The door shut with a muted click, and silence settled. I'm sorry about that, William said to Clara. I should have anticipated her reaction. It's all right, Clara said quietly. I've dealt with worse conversations. William looked at her as if he wanted to ask more, but he stopped himself. Instead, he gave a small nod and left the laundry room. Clara exhaled slowly, her hands resting on the folded towels. She had worked in many homes over the years, but few moments had made the lines between employer and employee feel so stark and so dangerous to cross. But later that day, William would ask her a question that would blur those lines even more. The request came that afternoon, when the winter light outside had turned pale and the air in the house felt weighted with silence. William found Clara in the sunroom, rocking the baby in a chair near the wide glass windows. The child's breathing was slow and steady, her tiny hand curled into Clara's sweater. Can we talk? William asked from the doorway. Clara looked up, cautious but composed. Of course. She stood and carefully placed the baby in a bassinet nearby, adjusting the blanket before stepping toward him. He led her into his study, closing the heavy oak door behind them. The room smelled faintly of leather and paper, with a low fire burning in the stone fireplace. William gestured toward the armchair opposite his desk. I've been thinking about last night, he began, and this morning's conversation with Amanda. You said something that stuck with me, that you've done this before with your own child. Clara folded her hands in her lap. Yes. I'd like to understand why it meant so much to you, he said. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but... He hesitated, almost uncomfortable with the request. I think it would help me understand the way you see things. Clara studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether to open that door. Finally, she spoke. I had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. My youngest, Alana, was born early. She had trouble breathing on her own, and the doctors weren't sure she'd make it. We spent weeks in the hospital, and when she finally came home, she was so fragile, I was afraid to let her out of my sight. Her voice softened, the words carrying a kind of quiet weight that filled the space between them. I'd sit beside her bassinet for hours, listening to every sound she made. Some nights I'd sleep on the floor because it felt wrong to be any farther away. My back would ache, my eyes would burn from exhaustion, but I didn't care. I wanted her to feel safe. William's expression was still, but his eyes followed her closely. And what happened to her? Clara's gaze shifted to the fire. She made it to her 5th birthday. Then she got sick again. Pneumonia this time. The hospital did what they could, but... She stopped, drawing in a slow breath before continuing. She didn't come home after that. William's voice was quiet. I'm sorry. Clara gave a small nod. It's been years, but certain things stay with you. Last night, when your granddaughter's forehead felt hot, I remembered every moment of sitting on that floor for my own child, and I couldn't bring myself to walk away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire popped softly, filling the gap. William leaned back in his chair. Most people wouldn't share something like that so openly. I've learned it's easier to be honest about where you've been, Clara said. You stop wasting energy hiding the parts of yourself that hurt. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. I didn't expect to feel unsettled by this. I've been a father, but I can't remember the last time I stayed up all night for a child's sake. I suppose I've always had someone else to do that. Clara's voice was gentle but firm. That's not uncommon in families with means, but love isn't something you can outsource entirely. Her words weren't accusatory, but they lingered in the room like a truth that had been waiting to be spoken. William tapped his fingers against the armrest. If I asked you to take a more permanent role here, would you consider it? Clara blinked, caught off guard. Permanent? Yes, he said, not just until Amanda finds a nanny. I mean being here for the long term. Whatever hours or conditions you need. She sat back, absorbing the offer. I'd have to think about that. My work matters to me, but so does keeping the right kind of boundaries. I can respect that, William said, but think about it. I trust you with her, and that's not something I say lightly. Clara gave a small smile, though her eyes were still wary. I'll think about it. He stood, and she followed his lead, leaving the study with a quiet nod. As William returned to his desk, he realized the conversation had left him with more questions than answers, not about Clara, but about himself. But when he finally made his decision later that week, it would ripple through the household in ways he didn't anticipate. The week passed under a layer of tension, like a storm waiting to break. William noticed the subtle shift in the air around the estate, quieter conversations when he entered a room, staff glancing between him and Clara, as if trying to guess what might happen next. By Thursday afternoon, the snow had begun to fall again, coating the driveway in a fine white sheet. William sat in his study, staring at a stack of contracts that seemed less urgent than the thought circling his mind for days. Finally, he pushed the papers aside and reached for the phone. Can you come in for a moment? He asked Clara when she answered. She appeared a few minutes later, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Is something wrong? No, William said, standing from his chair. I've made a decision about your position here. Clara stayed near the doorway, her posture straight but cautious. All right. I want you to stay, he said plainly, not as temporary help, but as a permanent caretaker for my granddaughter. Full salary, full benefits, your own living quarters in the guest wing. You'd have complete authority over her daily care. Her brow furrowed slightly. That's a generous offer, Mr. Hayes, but what about Amanda? She was clear about wanting a nanny of her choosing. I'll handle Amanda, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. My decision stands. Clara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked closer to the desk, her eyes fixed on him as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Why the change of heart? William considered his answer. Because I've seen the way you care for her. It's not just skill. It's something else. Something she needs. Something I can't buy from an agency. That something else is what got me in trouble with your daughter, Clara said with a faint, dry smile. Yes, William admitted, and I'd rather have someone who's willing to cross a line for the right reasons than someone who stays in their lane while the child suffers. Her eyes softened, but she didn't let her guard down completely. You understand this could cause friction in your family. I've lived with worse, William said. Besides, if my family can't handle a decision made for a child's welfare, then maybe the problem isn't the decision. Clara exhaled slowly. All right, I'll stay, but I want to make one thing clear. I'm here for her, not for politics, not for appearances. If that becomes a problem, then it will be my problem to solve, William finished. They held each other's gaze for a beat longer before Clara extended her hand. He shook it, his grip firm, the agreement sealed without another word. Later that evening, the change became official in the most visible way possible. William called a meeting in the main dining room, where the staff gathered around the long table. Amanda was there too, arms folded, her expression already tense. "I have an announcement," William began, his voice carrying through the room. "Clara will be staying on as my granddaughter's permanent caretaker, effective immediately." The reaction was instant. Some faces showed approval, others confusion, and Amanda's clear displeasure. "You didn't discuss this with me," she said sharply. "I didn't need to," William replied. "This is my decision." Amanda's jaw tightened, but she didn't push further in front of the staff. She stood abruptly and left the room, the echo of her heels fading down the hallway. The remaining staff exchanged looks, but no one spoke. Clara gave a small nod of acknowledgement, excused herself, and returned to the nursery. Upstairs, she stood over the crib, watching the baby's chest rise and fall. For a brief moment, the noise of the day faded away, replaced by a sense of calm she hadn't felt since arriving at the estate. Downstairs, William poured himself a drink in the study, aware that his choice had shifted the balance in the house. The lines between employer and employee were no longer so clear, and he was strangely fine with that. But the days ahead would prove that crossing those lines came with a price neither of them could fully predict. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later. Clara was in the nursery mid-morning, humming softly as she buttoned the baby's onesie, when Amanda appeared in the doorway. Her arms were crossed, and her expression carried the kind of restraint that suggested she'd rehearsed this moment. "I suppose congratulations are in order," Amanda said. Clara looked up, unsure whether it was sarcasm or sincerity. "For what?" "For securing a permanent position," Amanda replied. "My father didn't even consult me, which tells me exactly how much my opinion matters in this house." Clara's tone stayed even. "I didn't ask for him to go around you, but I'm not going to apologize for accepting work that allows me to care for your daughter." Amanda stepped into the room, lowering her voice. "You seem to think this is about you. It's not. It's about control. And whether or not you realize it, you've shifted the balance in this household." Clara gently lifted the baby into her arms, resting her against her shoulder. "If caring for her shifts the balance, then maybe the balance needed shifting." Amanda's eyes narrowed. "You're playing a dangerous game." "I'm not playing anything," Clara said, her voice calm but unshakable. "I'm just doing my job the way I believe it should be done." Amanda looked as though she wanted to argue, but she didn't. She turned on her heel and left the room without another word. That evening, William found Clara in the kitchen after the baby had gone to sleep. She was cleaning bottles at the sink when he stepped in. "I heard she confronted you," William said. "She's upset," Clara replied without looking up. "I don't blame her for feeling like things are out of her hands, but my focus is the baby, not her pride." William studied her profile for a moment. "You know, most people in your position would be worried about keeping their head down." Clara set the bottle aside and met his eyes. "I've lived long enough to know that keeping your head down doesn't always keep you safe. Sometimes you have to stand for what you know is right, even if it makes people uncomfortable." There was a quiet conviction in her voice that struck him. It wasn't about defiance. It was about a steady belief in her own principles. Over the next week, the tension in the house didn't disappear, but something else began to take root. A few of the staff who had been skeptical started to see the change in the baby, how she smiled more, fussed less, and seemed calmer in Clara's arms. Even Martha, who had initially questioned Clara's actions, admitted one afternoon, "She's thriving with you." Word of these small observations reached William, and they only reinforced his decision. He knew Amanda would eventually have to accept it, though it might not happen quickly. One afternoon, while Clara was reading to the baby in the sunroom, William stopped in the doorway. He didn't interrupt, just listened to the gentle rhythm of her voice and watched how the child's eyes followed her, how her little hand reached for Clara's sleeve. When Clara looked up and noticed him, she smiled faintly. She's going to have this whole book memorized before she can talk. William stepped closer. She's going to remember you. That matters more. Clara tilted her head. Children don't always remember the details, but they remember how they felt. I want her to grow up knowing she was loved and protected. That's what sticks. Her words settled in William's chest like a truth he hadn't considered before. For years, he'd thought providing for his family financially was enough. Now he understood there were forms of care money couldn't replace. and those were the ones that left the deepest marks. That night, William sat alone in his study, replaying the events of the past weeks. Clara's willingness to sleep on the floor, the conversations that followed, the resistance from Amanda, and the undeniable fact that his granddaughter was better for it. It wasn't just about Clara anymore. It was about what kind of example he wanted to set for the child. That meant choosing presence over distance and humanity over pride. The next morning at breakfast, William addressed Amanda directly. "We may not agree on how this happened," he said, "but Clara's staying because she's the best thing for your daughter. I hope one day you'll see that." Amanda didn't answer, but she didn't argue either. And for now, that was enough for William. Later, Clara carried the baby outside, bundled in a warm blanket, and stood on the patio overlooking the snow-covered pines. She breathed in the cold air and felt the baby's tiny body relax against hers. She thought about all the homes she'd worked in, the children she'd cared for, and the losses she'd endured. And she knew this much was true. Love, when freely given, had the power to change more than just the person receiving it. If you've ever seen someone go beyond what's expected just to show care, remember, those moments don't just pass by. They shape lives. And if you believe in that kind of care, subscribe and stay with us for more stories that remind us what truly matters.